The loner rancher waited for his mail-order bride. But a Chinese woman who didn't speak English, the ranch stood alone under a wide open sky, far from the noise of the town. It was the kind of place where the wind could be heard moving through dry grass and where sunsets stretched across the horizon like quiet paintings. The man who lived there had grown used to the silence. People in town called him the loner rancher, not because he was unkind, but because he kept to himself. He spoke only when necessary and preferred the company of his horses and cattle over crowded rooms. His name was Daniel. He was not old, but years of hard work had carved lines into his face. Every morning he woke before sunrise. He would boil water for coffee, pull on his worn boots, and step outside to begin feeding the animals. The routine never changed. The animals depended on him, and he depended on routine. It gave his life structure. It kept his mind busy. Years ago, he had dreamed of building a family on this land. He had built the ranch house with 2 bedrooms and even painted the walls in soft colors, thinking one day laughter would echo through the halls. But life had not gone as planned. A past relationship had ended quietly, leaving behind a deep disappointment he never spoke about. After that, he stopped trying. He focused only on work. As time passed, the loneliness grew heavier. It did not show on his face, but it followed him like a shadow. Evenings were the hardest. After finishing chores and cooking a simple meal, he would sit on the porch and watch the sky turn dark. The house felt too quiet. The empty second bedroom felt like a reminder of something missing. One afternoon, while picking up mail from the small post office in town, he noticed a folded paper tucked between bills and advertisements. It spoke about international introductions, about people from different countries looking for honest partnerships and simple lives. He almost threw it away. The idea felt strange to him. But that night, sitting alone at his kitchen table, he unfolded the paper again. He read every line carefully. It spoke of women who valued family, who wanted stability and respect. It mentioned translation services for letters. Daniel had never thought of looking beyond his small town. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had nothing to lose. The next week, he filled out a simple form. He wrote honestly about himself. He did not try to impress anyone. He wrote that he was a rancher. He wrote that he believed in hard work, loyalty, and quiet evenings. He wrote that he was not perfect, but he would always try to do what was right. After sending the letter, he felt both foolish and hopeful. Weeks passed with no response. He told himself it was better that way. But then one afternoon, a letter arrived with foreign stamps. His hands felt slightly unsteady as he opened it. Inside was a neatly written message from a woman in China. Her English was simple, and some parts were clearly translated, but her words felt sincere. She wrote about wanting a peaceful life, about leaving behind crowded cities, and about valuing honesty. Her name was May. Their letters continued. At first, they wrote about small things. She asked about the ranch, about the animals, about the seasons. He told her about early mornings and long days. She shared stories about her childhood, about helping her parents in a small family shop. She explained that life had been difficult and she wanted something steady and safe. Even though they had never met, a quiet understanding began to grow between them. Their conversations were not full of big promises. They were simple, honest, real. Months later, after many letters and video calls with translation help, they made a decision. May would come to America and start a new life with him. Daniel knew it was a big step. He worried about the language barrier. He worried about cultural differences. But he also felt something he had not felt in years: anticipation. He began preparing the house. He fixed the broken gate near the barn. He cleaned the spare bedroom carefully, placing fresh sheets on the bed. He even planted flowers near the porch, something he had never cared about before. Each small task made the idea more real. The day of her arrival finally came. Daniel drove to the train station 2 hours away. The sky was clear and his thoughts were loud. What if she changed her mind? What if he disappointed her? He was not a man of fancy words. He did not know how to impress anyone. All he had was honesty and a quiet life. When the train pulled in, people stepped off one by one. Families greeted each other with excitement. Travelers hurried past. Then he saw her. May stood near the platform holding a small suitcase. She looked around carefully, her expression a mix of hope and nervousness. She wore a simple dress and carried herself with quiet dignity. When their eyes met, there was a pause, as if both were confirming that this was real. Daniel stepped forward and gave a small wave. "May," he asked gently. She smiled and nodded. Daniel, she replied softly. Her accent was noticeable and her English was limited, but her voice was calm. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say. The months of letters suddenly felt far away compared to standing face to face. Daniel took her suitcase, trying to appear confident even though his heart was racing. The drive back to the ranch was quiet. He tried to speak slowly. Long trip, he asked. Yes, she answered with a small laugh. Very long. They both smiled at the simplicity of the conversation. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, just uncertain. Outside the truck window, wide fields stretched endlessly. May watched everything closely, taking in the open space. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to set. The sky glowed orange and pink. May stepped out of the truck and stood still, looking around. The house, the barn, the fences, it was very different from the crowded streets she had described in her letters. Daniel watched her carefully, trying to read her reaction. Home, he said quietly. She looked at him and nodded. Beautiful, she replied. Inside the house, everything felt slightly different now that she was there. The empty rooms no longer felt forgotten. May placed her suitcase in the bedroom he had prepared. She ran her hand gently across the wooden dresser, as if memorizing her new surroundings. Dinner that night was simple, roasted vegetables and bread. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table. Conversation was slow and careful. They used gestures and simple words. Sometimes they misunderstood each other and laughed softly at the confusion. Later, Daniel showed her the porch. They sat side by side, watching the stars appear. The night air was cool and calm. May looked up at the sky with quiet wonder. Many stars, she said softly. Yes, Daniel replied, every night. For the first time in a long while, the ranch did not feel lonely. It felt uncertain, yes, it felt new and unfamiliar, but it also felt alive. As the night grew darker, Daniel realized something important. This journey would not be easy. There would be misunderstandings. There would be moments of doubt. Two people from different worlds were now sharing one roof. But as he glanced at May sitting beside him, he felt a small but steady sense of hope. The wind moved gently through the grass. The animals settled for the night. Inside the quiet ranch house, a new chapter had begun. The morning after May's arrival, the ranch woke slowly. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of the kitchen, casting long shadows across the floor. Daniel had already risen, dressed in his worn jeans and boots. He moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing breakfast while listening to the soft sounds of the animals outside. The smell of coffee filled the room, and the quiet comfort of routine returned him to a sense of normalcy. But this morning was different. May was here now, sharing this quiet life with him. May emerged from the spare bedroom, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. She had slept well despite the long journey, though her eyes still carried the fatigue of travel. Her dress was simple, practical for the ranch, yet her posture carried an elegance that made her seem like someone from another world. She looked around the kitchen with curiosity, taking in the simplicity of the appliances, the neatly stacked plates, and the scent of fresh bread Daniel had baked. Everything was new to her, yet she observed with calm attention. Daniel set a plate of eggs and bread in front of her. Eat, he said simply, his voice quiet but firm. Words felt heavy to him sometimes, especially when trying to communicate with someone who did not fully understand English. May nodded and smiled, her hands folding neatly in her lap before she began eating. She picked up a fork and tried to mimic the way Daniel had arranged the food. She struggled slightly, and Daniel chuckled softly. The sound startled her at first, but then she laughed too. It was a small moment, but it broke the ice. After breakfast, Daniel showed her around the ranch. He led her through the fields where horses grazed lazily in the morning sun. He showed her the barn, explaining in short, slow sentences what each tool was for. May listened carefully, repeating words she could remember, pointing at objects, and occasionally laughing when she mispronounced a word. Her determination to understand and to participate impressed him. He realized quickly that patience would be their greatest tool. The horses were her first challenge. She had never ridden before, but she observed how Daniel approached them with confidence and calm. When he motioned for her to try, she hesitated. Daniel crouched down to her level. Gentle, he said. Quiet. Calm, she nodded, placing her hands on the horse's mane as instructed. The horse snorted and she jumped back, startled. Daniel laughed quietly, steadying the animal and guiding her again. By the end of the morning, she could brush the horse without fear. Small victories like these became the foundation of their early days. Meals were another lesson. May wanted to help, though she had little experience with cooking for so many. Daniel had grown used to simple meals: eggs, bread, stew, and roasted vegetables. She watched him, copying his movements, occasionally asking for clarification in her broken English. Daniel answered with gestures and simple words. When she made a mistake, burning a slice of bread or spilling milk, he smiled instead of scolding. They laughed together, sharing the small imperfections of life. Slowly, the kitchen became a place of cooperation and quiet joy rather than just routine. Evenings were the hardest for communication. Words were limited, and misunderstandings arose often. Daniel would tell stories about the ranch, about storms that came and went, about long winters when snow covered the land. May listened intently, nodding at the right moments, occasionally asking questions with broken sentences. It was difficult, but they learned to understand each other through tone, gestures, and expression. Sometimes she would point to an object or place and say its name in her language, then slowly repeat it in English. Daniel repeated the word back to her, trying to learn pronunciation. These small exercises built trust and understanding between them. The first time they had a serious misunderstanding, it was over chores. Daniel had asked her to feed the chickens in the afternoon while he repaired a fence. She misunderstood and went to the barn instead. When Daniel returned, he found the chickens unfed and the barn clean and tidy. Frustration prickled at him. May looked confused and anxious, sensing his irritation. She tried to apologize in broken English, but Daniel realized it was not her fault. He took a deep breath, gently guided her to the chicken coop, and showed her again how to feed them. Her face relaxed, and she laughed softly, embarrassed but willing to try again. That day, he understood that patience would always be needed, and May realized that mistakes were part of learning. Days passed in a rhythm both familiar and new. Daniel found himself speaking more slowly, using gestures, and finding joy in the small successes they shared. May's confidence grew steadily. She began identifying animals, remembering the English names of tools, and even learning simple phrases to ask questions. Daniel admired her perseverance. He had never expected this. A quiet pride settled in him as he watched her adapt and embrace life on the ranch. Neighbors began noticing the new presence on the ranch. At first, they were curious, visiting occasionally under the guise of casual conversation. Some were kind, offering advice or simple greetings. Others were skeptical, unsure of how to feel about a foreign woman living so far from town. May listened quietly to the neighbors, sometimes responding in English, sometimes smiling politely without speaking. Daniel felt protective, sensing her unease in unfamiliar situations. He began accompanying her to town more often, introducing her and ensuring she felt safe. One afternoon, May tried planting vegetables in a small garden next to the house. Daniel had never thought much about gardening, but she seemed enthusiastic. She dug small holes, placed seeds carefully, and watered them with a concentration that reminded him of how she approached everything. Daniel helped quietly, offering guidance when needed. Watching her work, he realized she was bringing new life not just to the soil but to the ranch itself. Little by little, the barren edges of the property began to feel warmer, more lived in, more like home. Evenings became times of reflection. They would sit on the porch, watching the sun set, sharing quiet companionship. Words were often unnecessary. A glance, a gesture, or a smile conveyed understanding and care. On nights when the sky was clear, May would point to stars, naming them in her language. Daniel listened, asking her to repeat the names slowly. He marveled at how she could find beauty in the simplest things, and he found himself noticing things he had ignored for years. The way the wind moved, the soft call of an owl, the rhythm of the horses breathing in the barn. One night during a particularly calm evening, May shared a part of her past. Using broken English, gestures, and translation tools, she spoke of her family and the difficulties she had faced in the city. Daniel listened carefully. She did not dwell on sadness. Instead, she spoke of hope, of wanting a peaceful life, and of believing that hard work could build a good future. He realized that their connection was not about words alone. It was about courage, trust, and the willingness to adapt to each other's worlds. By the end of the second week, a routine had formed. Mornings began with chores and breakfast, afternoons with work around the ranch, and evenings with quiet reflection. They had developed a rhythm that balanced independence with companionship. Daniel noticed small changes in himself. He smiled more, spoke more gently, and even found joy in teaching May things he had taken for granted. May, in turn, seemed more confident, moving through the ranch with purpose and curiosity, her presence filling the spaces that had once felt empty. However, not every moment was easy. Language barriers still caused tension. There were days when neither could understand the other fully, leading to frustration or misinterpretation. Daniel had to remind himself to remain patient, to see the effort behind the words rather than the mistake itself. May had to trust that he would not judge her for errors or misunderstandings. Each challenge became an opportunity to grow closer, to develop respect and empathy. One evening, as rain began to fall softly on the roof, they worked together to secure the barn doors and move supplies to higher ground. The storm created a sense of urgency, requiring them to communicate quickly despite limited language skills. They relied on gestures, pointing, and actions rather than words. By the time the rain slowed, they were soaked but smiling. The shared experience, though exhausting, strengthened their bond. They realized that words were helpful, but understanding could also be built through shared effort. After the storm, the ranch looked fresh and renewed. The grass smelled sweet, the soil dark and rich, and the animals were safe. Daniel and May sat inside with hot tea, warming their hands and drying off. May looked at him, eyes shining with quiet satisfaction. He smiled back, realizing that they had already accomplished something together without fully understanding each other's language. They had learned to rely on trust, action, and patience. Over time, the ranch transformed little by little through their joint effort. Paths were cleared, fences repaired, and small gardens flourished. May introduced new routines, gentle touches, and small surprises that made the home feel lived in. Daniel noticed how much lighter the ranch felt with her presence. The loneliness that had settled in for years began to fade. In its place grew a slow, steady companionship that neither had anticipated but both had begun to cherish. By the end of the month, the ranch no longer felt like the quiet, empty place it had once been. It had life, energy, and warmth. Daniel and May had found ways to communicate, to work together, and to understand each other despite language and cultural differences. They had faced challenges, small misunderstandings, and moments of doubt, but they had emerged closer, stronger, and more connected. As night fell, they sat once again on the porch. The stars blinked above them, and a cool breeze moved through the fields. May leaned slightly toward Daniel, a small gesture of trust and companionship. Daniel looked at her, feeling a quiet sense of hope he had not known in years. Their journey had only just begun, but the foundation of their life together was taking shape, brick by brick, through patience, effort, and a shared willingness to adapt. Life on the ranch had settled into a slow rhythm, but Daniel could feel that challenges were coming. The quiet trust he had begun to build with May was strong, but there were moments when differences and misunderstandings tested their connection. One morning, as the sun rose over the wide fields, Daniel noticed that May was unusually quiet. She moved through the chores with her usual care but seemed distracted, her brow furrowed as she worked. Daniel approached her while she tended the garden. "Everything okay?" he asked slowly, careful to keep his words simple. May paused, looking up at him with uncertainty. She tried to answer in English, but her words came out haltingly broken, and Daniel struggled to understand. Sensing her frustration, he took a deep breath. "Show me," he said, pointing to the plants she was watering. She nodded and began pointing to different rows of vegetables, miming the problems she had noticed. Some plants were wilting, others had small pests damaging the leaves. Daniel realized she was worried about the garden failing. He knelt down beside her, explaining step by step how to protect the plants, using gestures and simple words. She watched closely, copying his actions, and slowly her anxiety eased. Through these small challenges, Daniel began to see how her determination and care were shaping the ranch. Her attention to detail, her willingness to work hard, and her eagerness to learn impressed him deeply. He understood that she was not just trying to survive in a new country, she was actively trying to build a life with him. But life was not always predictable. One afternoon, a letter arrived that brought tension neither of them expected. Daniel had been sorting the mail when he found official documents from the correspondence agency. He began reading, and as he scanned the pages, his heart sank slightly. There were details he had not fully understood about the agreement, including some fees and conditions that seemed unclear. He worried that May might have misunderstood certain parts of the arrangement, or that she might feel obligated in ways he had not intended. He tried to hide his concern, but May noticed the change in his expression. She approached him, speaking in her broken English, asking if everything was okay. Daniel sighed, realizing that explaining the situation would be difficult. Words were limited, and he did not want to frighten her. Instead, he chose to show her the papers, pointing to certain parts and explaining as best he could. May watched carefully, her eyes wide with concern. She nodded slowly, but Daniel could see she did not fully understand. The next few days were awkward. Both of them felt a distance that had not existed before. They continued daily tasks, but their interactions were cautious, polite, and quieter than usual. Daniel worried about whether their bond could survive misunderstandings, and May feared that she had disappointed him. The ranch, which had once felt warm and full of promise, seemed to grow a little colder under the tension. One evening, the storm arrived. Heavy clouds rolled across the sky, and the wind began to whip through the trees and across the fields. Rain fell in sheets, and the animals became restless. Daniel knew the barn doors would not hold if left unreinforced, and some of the feed in the storage shed could be damaged by water. He called for May to help, but she hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She pointed to the barn, then back at herself, as if asking what she should do. Daniel took a deep breath and pointed at the barn door, then at himself, motioning that they should work together. They moved quickly through the storm. Water soaked their clothes, and the wind made it difficult to hear one another. Words were useless, so they relied on gestures and actions. Daniel held the barn door while May secured the latches, mimicking his movements. They moved buckets of feed together, balancing them carefully to prevent spills. By the time the storm began to lessen, the barn was secure and the animals were safe. They stood together, soaked and exhausted, and finally smiled at each other. The tension from the previous days seemed to melt away in that shared effort. After the storm, they returned to the house. Daniel brewed hot tea while May dried her hair with a towel. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping the warm liquid and letting the calm of the evening fill the room. Daniel realized that actions often spoke louder than words, and this storm had reminded him that trust could be built even without perfect understanding. May, too, seemed to sense that they had overcome something together. She reached out her hand, placing it gently over his, a silent gesture of connection and reassurance. The following weeks were a time of growth and learning. May began to understand more of Daniel's language, practicing words and phrases she had learned from his patient corrections. Daniel, in turn, tried to learn a few words of her language, repeating them slowly and laughing when he mispronounced them. These small exchanges brought laughter and lightness back into the house. The ranch itself became more alive under their joint effort. Fields that had once seemed empty now held rows of vegetables, neatly planted and cared for. Animals thrived under their combined attention, and the small home felt warm, with signs of May's presence everywhere. Small baskets woven neatly on shelves, herbs drying in the sun, and the soft scent of teas she had learned to brew. The ranch was no longer just Daniel's domain. It had become a shared space, shaped by both of their hands and hearts. However, life was still unpredictable. One afternoon, a neighbor came by to check on them. She noticed May working in the garden and called out in English, praising her efforts. May replied with a shy smile and a few words she had learned, struggling to communicate fully. The neighbor seemed skeptical, questioning Daniel about the arrangement and whether May was truly there by choice. Daniel felt a surge of protectiveness. He spoke clearly, explaining that May was there because she wanted a quiet life on the ranch, that she was free to choose, and that she was learning quickly. May watched him carefully, and he saw the trust in her eyes. The conversation ended, but it reminded Daniel that outside judgments could be another challenge for them. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Daniel and May sat on the porch together. May spoke slowly, describing parts of her life in China, the crowded streets, the markets, and her childhood memories of helping her parents in the small shop. Her words were simple, but the stories were full of emotion. Daniel listened, learning about the world she had left behind. He realized how much courage it had taken for her to come so far, to leave everything familiar, and to trust a man she had never met in person. Daniel shared stories, too, about the winters on the ranch, the storms that had tested his fences, and the days when loneliness had been his only companion. May listened, nodding, understanding more than she could say. In those quiet hours, the bond between them deepened. They were learning not just to communicate, but to understand each other's hearts. As the nights passed, the ranch settled into a new kind of rhythm. They worked together, learned together, and faced challenges as a team. The storm and the misunderstandings had tested them, but they had emerged stronger, more connected, and more confident in their shared life. Each day, their communication improved and the trust between them grew. By the end of part 3, Daniel realized something important. Building a life with May would not always be easy. There would be obstacles, both from misunderstandings and from the judgments of others. But he also realized that together they could face anything. May's presence had brought a new light into his life, a quiet warmth that filled the spaces he had once thought would remain empty forever. And May, too, felt a growing sense of belonging. The ranch, the wide open fields, and the quiet evenings had become a new home. The man who had seemed distant and unapproachable was becoming someone she could rely on, someone she trusted. Their journey was far from complete, but the foundation of understanding, patience, and shared effort was stronger than ever. The next challenge would come, testing not just their ability to live together, but the strength of the connection they had built in these early weeks. But for now, as they watched the sky darken and stars appear, they sat in quiet companionship, knowing that together they had already overcome much. The following weeks brought a different kind of challenge to Daniel and May. Life on the ranch had begun to settle into a steady rhythm, but the quiet world they had built was about to be tested by the opinions and curiosity of the community around them. People in town had started noticing the changes. A Chinese woman living on the remote ranch, helping with chores, speaking broken English, and adjusting to life far from the city. Some neighbors were curious and kind, but others were skeptical and judgmental, casting glances and whispering as they passed by. One morning, a neighbor named Mrs. Harper stopped by, a tall woman with a sharp look and a voice that carried authority in the small town. She walked up to the porch, her eyes scanning May carefully. "Good morning," she said. "You're the new lady here, right?" May smiled politely, her hands folded in front of her. "Yes," she said slowly. "May." Her accent was soft and her voice carried both politeness and caution. Mrs. Harper continued, "Well, I hope you understand how things work around here. Life on a ranch is not easy, and it's not the same as life in the city. You need to be careful, young lady." She glanced at Daniel, who nodded politely but said nothing. May tried to respond, but her English was limited. Mrs. Harper repeated her words slowly, emphasizing the need to adjust, to work hard, and to respect local customs. Though the conversation was polite, the judgment in her tone was clear. After Mrs. Harper left, Daniel looked at May. "Don't worry about them," he said softly. "People talk. It is always like that." May nodded, understanding enough to sense his protective tone. She had learned that patience and quiet strength were often the best way to handle suspicion and judgment. The next days were filled with small tests of their bond. Some neighbors would drop by under the guise of casual visits, asking questions, offering advice, or observing quietly. May learned to respond with a smile, sometimes using words she had learned, sometimes simply nodding. Daniel walked beside her, introducing her to people, explaining that she had chosen to come to the ranch to live a quiet life, and that she was learning quickly. His protective presence made her feel safer and more confident. As time passed, May grew more comfortable in her role on the ranch. She began taking initiative, organizing small chores, planting new vegetables, and cleaning and arranging the house with care. Daniel noticed how her presence transformed the space. The once quiet ranch now had a gentle energy, small touches of beauty and order that reflected her patience and thoughtfulness. He realized that she was not only adapting to life on the ranch, but also improving it in ways he had never imagined. One evening, Daniel decided to take May to town for a small festival. It was a local event, held in the town square with music, food, and decorations. The festival was a way for neighbors to celebrate together, and Daniel thought it would be a good opportunity for May to see the community in a lighter, more welcoming context. As they walked through the streets, May observed everything carefully. The music, the colorful lights, the smell of freshly baked bread and roasted corn. It was all new to her. Daniel introduced her to a few people he knew, smiling as she responded politely with her slow, careful English. There were moments of awkwardness, but also moments of genuine connection. When a child ran past and asked for a friendly greeting, May knelt down, smiling and waving. Daniel noticed the warmth she brought, even without perfect words. At the festival, there was a small gathering where residents were invited to speak briefly. Daniel encouraged May to say a few words. She hesitated at first, unsure if she could speak English well enough, but with gentle encouragement, she stepped forward. Using the simple phrases she had learned, she thanked the community for welcoming her and for helping her feel at home. Her voice was soft but steady, and the crowd responded with polite applause. Daniel watched with quiet pride, seeing her courage and determination. That evening, walking back to the ranch, they talked about the day. May expressed how nervous she had been, but also how much she had enjoyed the festival. Daniel explained that people often misunderstood new things, but that showing kindness and respect could change their minds. May nodded, understanding that adapting to a new life was as much about patience and effort as it was about learning words. Despite the small successes, challenges continued to arise. One morning, a strong windstorm swept across the ranch, knocking over a section of the fence and scattering feed bins. Daniel and May worked together to repair the damage. The wind made it difficult to hear each other, and miscommunication led to minor mistakes. May moved too quickly with a post, almost dropping it, and Daniel had to catch it just in time. They laughed at the chaos, but the experience reminded them that working together required constant attention, trust, and patience. After the storm, Daniel sat with May on the porch, holding a cup of tea. "Storms happen," he said, "but together we can fix things." May smiled, leaning slightly closer. Though words were limited, their understanding was clear. They had learned to rely not only on language, but also on actions, gestures, and shared effort. Each challenge they faced brought them closer and strengthened the trust between them. As days turned into weeks, the relationship between Daniel and May continued to grow. The initial excitement and curiosity had evolved into routine, companionship, and shared purpose. Daniel found himself looking forward to the mornings when they worked side by side. May discovered confidence in her abilities, feeling proud of the contributions she was making to the ranch. They laughed together, solved problems together, and shared quiet evenings watching the sun set over the fields. One evening, Daniel noticed May looking toward the horizon, her expression thoughtful. He asked her what she was thinking, and she responded in slow, careful English, describing memories from her home country. She spoke of family, friends, and the life she had left behind. Though her words were simple, the emotion behind them was strong. Daniel listened attentively, realizing that she was carrying both hope and longing in her heart. He took her hand gently, a silent gesture of support and connection. "Home is here now," he said. May nodded, understanding enough to feel reassurance. Their lives had been shaped by distance and courage, and now, together, they were building a new home on the ranch. Challenges continued, but the most important change was internal. Both Daniel and May were learning to trust each other completely. The language barrier, cultural differences, and outside judgment were no longer obstacles. They were simply parts of the journey. Through patience, effort, and understanding, they had created a partnership that was strong and resilient. By the end of Part 4, the ranch had become more than just a place to live. It was a home filled with shared memories, effort, and hope. Daniel no longer felt the heavy loneliness that had defined his life for so long. May had found a place where she could belong, learn, and grow. Together, they had faced storms, misunderstandings, and skepticism from the outside world. And they had emerged stronger, more connected, and ready for whatever challenges might come next. The story of the loner rancher and the woman who had traveled across the world to start a new life was no longer just about survival or adaptation. It was about connection, trust, and the quiet courage that allows two people from different worlds to build a life together. And as they looked out over the fields at sunset, the soft glow of the evening casting shadows across the land, they both understood that their journey had only just begun, and that together they could face anything. Life on the ranch had grown familiar, but it was far from ordinary. Daniel and May had faced storms, misunderstandings, and the quiet judgment of neighbors, yet their bond had grown stronger with every challenge. They had learned to rely on each other, not only for work but for understanding and companionship. Yet a new challenge emerged, one that would test the strength of their connection more deeply than anything before. One morning, a letter arrived for May from her family in China. Daniel noticed her expression change as she opened it. The letter contained news about her family's financial situation, and it implied that she could return home to help and secure a stable future. She held the paper in her hands, hesitating, unsure how to respond. Daniel watched silently, understanding that this was more than just a letter. It was a choice that could change their lives entirely. For the first time, they faced a decision that could separate them. Daniel's heart grew heavy, not with anger, but with fear of losing her. May looked at him, her eyes searching for understanding. She tried to explain, her broken English carrying the weight of both hope and doubt. "Family, need me, maybe better life," she said slowly. Daniel nodded, trying to make sense of her words. He realized she was torn between the life she had started on the ranch and the obligations of her past. That evening, they sat together on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Daniel spoke slowly, carefully choosing his words. "You can go," he said. "If your family needs you, I will understand." May shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "But here, I want stay with you," she said, her words halting but clear. The honesty in her voice touched Daniel deeply. He reached out, holding her hands gently. "Then we decide together," he said softly. "We find way both happy." They spent the next few days discussing their options. Using translation tools and simple phrases, they shared their hopes and fears. May wanted to support her family, but she also wanted to honor the life they had begun together. Daniel wanted her to be happy, but he could not imagine the ranch without her. Slowly, they found a solution that honored both of their desires. They decided that May would write to her family, explaining her choice to stay for the moment, and that together they would find a way to help them from afar. It was a compromise, but it was born of love, respect, and mutual understanding. With the decision made, a sense of peace returned to the ranch. The work continued as usual, but now there was a deeper sense of connection and purpose. They tended the animals, repaired fences, and cultivated the fields together, each day adding to the life they were building. Their bond was no longer tentative. It was strong, rooted in shared experience, patience, and trust. The community continued to watch, and slowly attitudes began to change. People noticed May's dedication, her willingness to work hard, and her quiet kindness. Neighbors who had been skeptical started to acknowledge her efforts, sometimes offering help, sometimes simply nodding with respect. Daniel noticed the change, realizing that perseverance and genuine character could overcome prejudice. May's courage and determination had not only shaped the ranch, but also earned her acceptance. One evening, as the first snow of the season fell softly across the fields, Daniel and May sat inside by the fireplace. The warmth of the flames and the soft glow of lamplight created a feeling of comfort and security. May looked around the room, noting the small changes they had made together. Baskets of dried herbs, neatly folded blankets, and small decorations that reflected both of their tastes. The house felt alive, filled with memories and shared effort. Daniel spoke softly, his voice carrying gratitude and affection. "I am glad you stay," he said. May smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "Me too, happy here," she replied. They held hands, sitting in silence, feeling the quiet joy of shared companionship. Words were no longer necessary to express the depth of their connection. Over the following weeks, life continued with a sense of normalcy that was rich with meaning. The ranch flourished under their care. New crops grew, animals thrived, and the home became a place of comfort and warmth. May's English improved steadily, allowing her to communicate more freely with Daniel and with neighbors. Daniel learned more about her culture, tasting her cooking, listening to her stories, and celebrating small traditions from her homeland. Their lives became a blend of two worlds, each respecting and learning from the other. One day, Daniel received a visitor from town, a young man who wanted to buy some of his farm equipment. While negotiating the sale, he noticed May tending the garden, her movements confident and skilled. He paused, observing her for a moment before commenting, "You've really made this place shine." May smiled and bowed slightly, replying in simple English, "Thank you." Daniel felt a quiet pride, knowing that her presence had not only transformed the ranch but also reshaped how others saw them. As the months passed, Daniel and May grew closer in ways that words could not fully capture. They learned to anticipate each other's needs, to support each other silently, and to communicate through gestures, expressions, and shared tasks. The language barrier that had once seemed daunting was now a small obstacle compared to the trust and understanding they had built. Their life together was no longer about adjustment. It was about partnership, love, and shared purpose. Winter settled over the ranch, bringing long nights and cold winds. The animals required extra care, and the fields were covered in snow, but the two of them faced it together. They built fires in the barn to keep the animals warm, repaired fences as needed, and ensured that the home was comfortable. The harshness of the season reminded them of the strength they had developed together and the importance of relying on one another. One night, after a long day of chores, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the snow fall softly over the fields. May rested her head on Daniel's shoulder, and he felt a quiet contentment that he had never experienced before. The isolation that had once weighed so heavily on him was replaced by companionship, trust, and hope. They had built something rare, a life together that was both real and resilient, shaped by shared effort and understanding. As the snow continued to fall, Daniel realized that he no longer feared loneliness. He had found a partner who was patient, kind, and brave. May, too, felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a home full of life, laughter, and connection. Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow and bringing new life to the fields. Crops began to sprout, animals gave birth to new young, and the home was filled with the sounds of growth and renewal. Daniel and May worked together, planting, repairing, and tending to the land with a renewed energy. Their partnership was no longer tentative. It was strong, built on months of shared challenges, learning, and triumphs. One afternoon, Daniel watched May walk through the fields, her hair catching the sunlight, her hands busy with planting. He felt a deep gratitude for her courage, determination, and kindness. She had crossed the world to start a new life with him, and together they had faced storms, misunderstandings, and the quiet judgment of others. Now they were stronger for it, bound by shared effort, trust, and love. As the day ended, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. The horizon was wide and bright, full of possibility. Daniel reached for May's hand, and she squeezed it gently, a silent affirmation of their bond. Words were unnecessary. They had already said everything through actions, gestures, and shared life. The ranch was no longer just a place of work. It was a symbol of their journey together. It had been shaped by patience, determination, and the willingness to face challenges as a team. Daniel and May had transformed not only the land, but also each other. They had built a life full of hope, trust, and quiet joy, proving that even the most unlikely partnerships could grow into something beautiful and enduring. As darkness fell and stars began to twinkle in the sky, they remained on the porch, holding hands and listening to the gentle sounds of the ranch at night. The wind moved through the trees, the animals slept peacefully, and the quiet of the land felt full rather than empty. Daniel and May had learned that love was not always easy, but it was always worth the effort. Their journey had been long, with challenges both small and great, but together they had found home, companionship, and a future filled with possibility. And as the night sky stretched endlessly above them, Daniel and May knew that they would face whatever came next, side by side, with courage, patience, and unwavering trust. The story of the loner rancher and the woman who had crossed an ocean to start a new life was not one of fairy tales or easy endings. It was a story of effort, understanding, and the quiet strength that comes from building a life together. In the end, they had found not only love but also belonging, proving that connection, patience, and shared determination could overcome any obstacle.